Some moments in life test who we really are when we choose to look away or stand up for what's right. In a crowded saloon, drunk outlaws began mocking a young woman while everyone turned their heads. Everyone except Eli McGraw. At 58, Eli was once known as the Quiet Gun, a man whose presence alone kept trouble at bay. He'd buried his brother and sworn off violence for good. But watching those men torment an innocent girl stirred something he thought he'd left behind. With calm words and one decisive move, Eli reminded that room what real courage looks like. What happened next would change everything, but would his choice cost him the peace he'd fought to find? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The sun rose slow over the Montana territory, casting long shadows across Eli McGraw's small ranch. He'd been awake for an hour. Already, sitting on the porch with his coffee, watching the light change from purple to gold across the eastern ridge. This was his favorite time of day, the world still quiet, the air cool and clean, nothing but the sound of wind moving through the pines. At 58, Eli had learned to appreciate simple things. The way morning light touched the mountains, the smell of coffee brewed strong and black, the creak of old wood settling beneath his boots. These were the gifts of a man who'd lived long enough to understand what mattered. His homestead sat 5 miles outside Silver Creek, tucked into a valley where a spring-fed creek ran year-round. The house was modest, 2 rooms, a stone fireplace, windows that faced east to catch the morning sun. He'd built most of it himself after he'd settled here 6 years ago, after Thomas died. The barn was older, came with the property. He kept 2 horses, a milk cow, and a small flock of chickens. It was enough for one man living alone. The land stretched out before him, maybe 40 acres of decent grazing, rimmed by pine forest on 3 sides. He'd repaired the fences that first year, cleared brush, planted a vegetable garden near the house where the soil was good. The work had been hard, but he'd needed it. Needed something to do with his hands, something to quiet his mind, something that didn't involve a gun. Eli finished his coffee and set the cup down on the porch rail. Time to feed the animals. He moved with the deliberate pace of a man who'd learned not to rush. His body still worked well enough, shoulders still broad, arms still strong from years of hard work, but he felt his age in his knees some mornings, in his lower back when the weather turned cold. The grey in his hair had spread from his temples to crown over the past few years. His face was weathered, lined deep around the eyes and mouth. He looked like what he was, a man who'd lived a full life and carried the marks of it. The horses nickered when they saw him coming. He forked hay into their stall, checked their water, ran his hand along the flank of the sorrel mare. Her name was Rosie, and she'd been with him since the beginning. Good horse, steady, the kind that didn't spook easy. He thought about Thomas while he worked, his younger brother by 3 years. Thomas had worn a deputy's badge in Silver Creek for nearly a decade, kept the peace in a town that had grown rough as the silver mines started playing out. Thomas had been good at his job, fair, honest, not afraid to stand up to troublemakers, but never quick to draw his gun. Everyone respected him. Eli had been different in those days. He'd made his reputation young, back when Silver Creek was booming, and every saloon had card games running late and tempers running hot. They'd called him the Quiet Gun because he didn't talk much before he drew, and when he did draw, it was over fast. He'd killed 3 men by the time he was 25, all fair fights, all men who'd pushed him into it. After that, his reputation kept most trouble away. Just his presence in a room was usually enough. He'd never wanted that reputation. Never sought out fights or wore his gun low like some kind of gunfighter. But he'd been good at it, too good, and that had made him something he never intended to be. A man people feared. Thomas had understood. Thomas had seen through the reputation to the brother underneath, the man who'd rather read a book or work with his hands than face down another fool with too much whiskey and too much pride. Thomas had been the bridge between who Eli was and who people thought he was. 5 years ago, a gang had ridden into Silver Creek. 6 men, led by a killer named Cade Brennan. They'd robbed the bank on a Tuesday afternoon, shot the clerk when he'd moved too slow for their liking. Thomas had been across the street at the general store when he'd heard the gunfire. He'd come running. Eli had been at his ranch that day, working on the barn roof. He'd heard about it later, how Thomas had confronted them as they'd come out with the money, how he'd ordered them to drop their guns and surrender, how Cade Brennan had laughed and shot him in the chest, how Thomas had gotten off one shot before he'd fallen, wounded Brennan in the shoulder before dying in the street. The gang had ridden out. Sheriff Dawson had been at the far end of town, too old and too slow to give chase. By the time Eli had gotten word and ridden into Silver Creek, Thomas was already gone. Doc Harlan had done what he could, but the bullet had torn through Thomas's lung. He died within minutes. Eli had stood over his brother's body in Doc Harlan's office, looking down at Thomas's face, so young still, only 32, and something had broken inside him. Not his grief. That was too big to break. But something else, some part of him that had always believed in justice, in the idea that being good at something meant you had an obligation to use that skill. He'd tracked Brennan's gang, caught up with them 3 days later near the Wyoming border. And what happened there, well, that was something Eli didn't let himself think about much anymore. There'd been 6 of them when they rode out of Silver Creek. There'd been none when Eli rode away from that camp. He'd come back to Silver Creek with the stolen money and turned it over to Sheriff Dawson. Then he'd gone to the cemetery on the hill east of town, stood at Thomas's fresh grave, and made a promise. No more killing. No more violence. He'd been good at it, too good, and it had cost him the only family he had left. Thomas had died because Eli hadn't been there, because he'd chosen a quiet life away from town while his brother faced danger alone. He'd sworn that day he'd never draw his gun in anger again. He'd go back to his ranch, tend his land, live the kind of peaceful life Thomas would have wanted for him. He'd put the violence behind him where it belonged, in the house, in the top drawer of the small bureau beside his bed. Eli kept Thomas's deputy badge. Silver, tarnished now, with a dent in one corner where it had stopped a different bullet years before. He'd taken it from Thomas's body before they'd buried him, kept it as a reminder of what violence cost, of why he'd chosen peace. He didn't look at it often, didn't need to. He felt its weight every day. Eli finished with the animals and walked back to the house. The sun was higher now, warming the air, burning off the morning chill. He washed his hands in the basin by the back door, then went inside to fix himself breakfast. Eggs from his chickens, bacon from the smokehouse, bread he'd baked 2 days ago. He ate slowly, looking out the window at his land. After breakfast he made a decision. He needed supplies, flour, sugar, coffee, a few other things. Silver Creek was 5 miles south. He could ride in, get what he needed, maybe have a drink at Old Pete's Saloon before heading back. He didn't go. To town often, maybe once a month. He was careful not to become a hermit, not to let the quiet of his ranch turn into isolation. A man needed to see other faces now and then, hear other voices. Even a man seeking peace needed some small connection to the world. He hitched Rosie to his small wagon, loaded a few things he wanted to trade: eggs, some vegetables from his garden. The ride to Silver Creek took just under an hour on the rough road that wound through the valley. Silver Creek had seen better days. The main street was wide, lined with wood-frame buildings that had been painted once but were peeling now. The Grand Hotel still stood at the north end, though it wasn't particularly grand anymore. The Silver Queen Saloon, Old Pete's place, sat across from the general store. Down the street was the bank, the sheriff's office, Doc Harlan's practice, a few other businesses. A church stood on a small rise at the southern edge of town, white paint gleaming in the sun. The town had boomed in the early 70s when silver had been found in the hills. Thousands of miners had flooded in, along with all the businesses that followed: miners' saloons, brothels, gambling halls, supply stores. The population had swelled to nearly 3,000 at its peak, but the silver had played out by the late 70s. The big mining operations had shut down one by one. People had drifted away, chasing the next strike, the next promise of wealth. Now, Silver Creek had maybe 500 souls on a good day. The ones who stayed were the ones who'd put down roots, families, business owners, folks who'd come to see the valley as home. Eli pulled his wagon up in front of Henley's general store. Sarah Henley was behind the counter, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and grey streaking through her dark hair. "Eli McGraw," she said, smiling. "Haven't seen you in a few weeks. How've you been keeping?" "Can't complain," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "Brought some eggs and vegetables if you're interested in trade." "Always am. Let me see what you've got." They conducted their business with the easy rhythm of people who'd done this many times before. Sarah was fair in her dealings, didn't try to squeeze an extra penny where it didn't belong. Eli respected that. He left with flour, sugar, coffee, and a few other necessities loaded in his wagon. The afternoon sun was warm as he stepped back onto the street. He glanced down toward the Silver Queen Saloon and made another decision. One drink wouldn't hurt. He hadn't had whiskey in months, and something about the day made him want company, even just the quiet companionship of old Pete behind the bar. He tied Rosie to the hitching post outside the saloon and pushed through the swinging doors. The Silver Queen was about what you'd expect, a long bar running down the right side, tables scattered across the floor, a few card games usually running in the back. The place smelled of whiskey, tobacco, and sawdust. A mirror hung behind the bar, probably the most expensive thing in the room. Old Pete kept the place relatively clean, which was more than you could say for some establishments. Pete looked up when Eli walked in. He was 70 if he was a day, with a full white beard and sharp blue eyes that didn't miss much. "Eli," he said, nodding. "Whiskey?" "Please." Pete poured 2 fingers into a clean glass and slid it across the bar. Eli laid down a coin and took a sip. "Good whiskey." Pete didn't water his drinks. The saloon was moderately busy for a Thursday afternoon. A few miners at one table, playing cards, 2 cowboys from one of the nearby ranches, drinking at the far end of the bar, a traveling salesman type sitting alone eating a meal Pete's cook had made, normal enough. Eli drank slowly, feeling the warmth spread through his chest. He was on his second sip when the doors swung open and trouble walked in. 4 men stumbled through the swinging doors, and Eli knew. Immediately, they were the wrong kind. He'd seen enough men like this in his younger days. Loud, drunk, looking for something to prove. They moved with that particular swagger that came from too much whiskey and not enough sense. The leader was tall, maybe 30 years old, with a scarred face and mean eyes. He wore his gun low, tied down like a gunfighter, though Eli doubted he had the skill to back up the posture. The others were younger, maybe mid-20s, following their leader's cues like dogs following the pack alpha. They spread out across the room, claiming space the way such men always did. The card game in the back went quiet. The 2 cowboys at the bar suddenly found their drinks very interesting. Even the traveling salesman seemed to shrink in his chair. Old Pete's expression didn't change, but Eli saw his shoulders tighten slightly. Pete had been running saloons for 40 years. He knew trouble when he saw it. "Whiskey," the leader said, his words slurred. "And don't water it down, old man." Pete poured without comment, set 4 glasses on the bar. The leader tossed back his drink and slammed the glass down hard enough to crack it. "Another." Pete poured again. Eli kept his eyes forward, sipping his own drink slowly. This wasn't his business. These men would drink, maybe cause some trouble, and eventually leave or pass out. Pete had handled worse. Sheriff Dawson would hear about it eventually, come by to settle things down if needed. Not Eli's business. The door opened again, and a young woman stepped inside. She couldn't have been more than 19, 20 at most. She wore a simple dress made of homespun fabric, faded blue, patched in a few places but clean. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical bun. She carried a wicker basket over one arm. Her face was plain, honest, the kind of face you saw on daughters of farmers and ranchers throughout the territory. She walked directly to old Pete, keeping her eyes down. "Excuse me, sir. My Mama sent me to pick up the preserves she ordered last week." Pete nodded. "I've got them in the back room, Sarah." "Just a moment." He disappeared through a door behind the bar, leaving the girl standing there alone. The scarred leader noticed her immediately. His eyes traveled over her in a way that made Eli's jaw tighten. The other three noticed their leader's attention and grinned. "Well, well," the leader said, moving closer to her. "What's a pretty little thing like you doing in a place like this?" The girl, Sarah, Pete had called her, kept her eyes down. "I'm just picking something up for my mama, sir. I'll be going soon as I get it." "Sir," one of the others mocked, his voice high and girlish. "She called you Sir, Dalton. Ain't that sweet?" Dalton moved closer, boxing her against the bar. "You know what I think? I think you came in here looking for some company, looking for real men to show you a good time." "Please," she said quietly, her voice trembling. "I just need to get my mama's preserves and go home." "Your mama," another one said, laughing. "What kind of mama sends her little girl into a saloon full of men?" "Maybe your mama wanted you to have some fun." The girl's face went red. Tears were starting to form in her eyes, but she kept them down, kept her chin tucked. Eli could see her hands shaking. "Come on, sweetheart," Dalton said, reaching out to touch her arm. "Don't be shy. We're just being friendly." She pulled back, but Dalton grabbed her wrist. Not rough enough to hurt, not yet, but firm enough that she couldn't easily pull away. "Let me go," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Let you go? But we're just getting to know each other." The room had gone completely silent. Everyone was watching, but no one was moving. The miners kept their eyes on their cards. The cowboys stared into their drinks. The traveling salesman looked at the wall. This was how it always went, Eli thought. Good people turning away because getting involved meant risk, meant potential violence, meant possibly getting hurt or killed. It was easier to look away, to tell yourself it wasn't your business, to hope someone else would step up. He understood it. He'd looked away himself, more times than he cared to admit, back when he was younger and angrier, and tired of being the one everyone expected to fix things. But understanding it didn't make it right. Old Pete came back through the door carrying a cloth-wrapped package. He saw what was happening and his face went hard. "That's enough," he said, his voice carrying authority despite his age. "The girl came for her mama's order. Let her have it and let her go." Dalton didn't even look at him. "Mind your business, old man. This doesn't concern you. This is my saloon. Everything that happens here concerns me. Is that right?" Dalton turned to face Pete, still holding the girl's wrist. "Maybe you need to learn some manners about respecting your betters." One of the other men laughed. "Maybe we should teach this whole town some respect." The girl was crying now, silent tears running down her face. She wasn't fighting Dalton's grip anymore, just standing there, shaking, waiting for whatever was going to happen next. Eli looked at her face, saw the terror there, saw the way everyone else in the room was carefully not seeing it. He thought about Thomas, about the badge in his drawer, about the promise he'd made. He thought about the kind of man he'd been trying to become these past 5 years. A peaceful man, a man who'd left violence behind. But he also thought about what Thomas would have done in this moment. Thomas wouldn't have looked away. Thomas had died because he'd stood up for what was right, even when it meant facing down men with guns. Sometimes peace meant walking away from a fight. And sometimes it meant standing up when everyone else sat down. Eli set his glass on the bar. The soft clink of glass on wood seemed loud in the quiet room. He stood up. "Let the girl go," he said. His voice was calm, quiet, steady. The voice of a man who didn't need to raise his voice to be heard. Dalton turned, finally noticing him. His eyes traveled over Eli, taking in the grey hair, the weathered face, the plain clothes. He saw an old man. Nothing to worry about. "This your grandpa, sweetheart?" Dalton said to the girl, grinning. "Come to protect you," I said. "Let her go." Eli took a step forward. Just one step, but something in the way he moved made Dalton's grin falter slightly. "Or what, old man? You going to make me?" Eli didn't answer. He just stood there, relaxed, his hands at his sides. But old Pete recognized something. Pete had been in Silver Creek during Eli's younger days. He'd seen the quiet gun before. "Dalton," Pete said quietly. "I'd listen to him if I were you." "That's Eli McGraw." The name didn't register immediately, but one of the other men, an older one who'd been quiet until now, went pale. "McGraw," he said. "The quiet gun?" Dalton looked uncertain now. "That's just an old story. Look at him, he's ancient. I've seen what he can do," the older outlaw said. His hand moved away from his gun, a deliberate gesture. "I was in Deadwood in '76. Saw him drop 2 men before they cleared leather. I ain't looking to see that again." Dalton was still holding the girl's wrist, but his grip had loosened. He was trying to decide if his pride was worth the risk. "Let her go," Eli said again, still quiet, still calm. "Take your friends and leave. Nobody needs to get hurt today." For a long moment, nothing happened. The entire saloon held its breath. Then Dalton shoved the girl away, hard enough that she stumbled. He faced Eli square, his hand hovering near his gun. "Maybe I want to see if the stories are true," he said. "Maybe I want to be the man who killed the quiet gun." Eli felt something old and familiar stirring in his chest, something he'd tried to bury, the part of him that knew exactly how this would end, the part that had always known. "Walk away," Eli said. "Please, I'm asking you nicely. Walk away, and nobody dies today." Dalton's hand moved toward his gun. What happened next was over in less than 2 seconds. Dalton's hand was still moving when Eli crossed the distance between them. No gun, no shot fired. Just movement, fast, economical, practiced. Eli's hand caught Dalton's wrist before the gun cleared the holster. His other hand struck Dalton's throat, not hard enough to crush, but hard enough to paralyze the man's breathing for a moment. Dalton's eyes went wide. He made a choking sound. Eli twisted his wrist, forcing him down to his knees, and removed the gun from its holster. He tossed it across the room, where it clattered harmlessly into a corner. The other 3 outlaws had their hands on their guns, but they hadn't drawn. The older one shook his head slightly, warning them. Eli released Dalton, who collapsed to the floor, gasping for air. "I told you," Eli said quietly. "Nobody needed to get hurt." He looked at the other 3. "Get him up. Get out. Don't come back." They moved fast, grabbing Dalton under the arms and hauling him to his feet. The leader's face was purple, his eyes watering, but he was breathing again. They dragged him toward the door. At the threshold, Dalton found his voice. It came out as a ragged croak. "This isn't over, old man." "Yes," Eli said. "It is." They stumbled out into the afternoon sun. The doors swung shut behind them. The saloon stayed quiet for another moment. Then, slowly, the normal sounds resumed. Someone coughed. Cards shuffled. A chair scraped against the floor. Eli turned to the girl. She was still pressed against the bar, tears streaming down her face. The package of preserves sat where old Pete had left it. "Are you all right?" Eli asked gently. She nodded, unable to speak. "What's your name?" "Sarah," she whispered. "Sarah Whitmore. Sarah, you did nothing wrong. You understand? Nothing that happened here was your fault." She nodded again, wiping at her tears with the back of her hand. "Pete," Eli said. "Help her get home safe." "I will," Pete said. He came around the bar and picked up the package. "Come on, Sarah. I'll walk you to your wagon." As they moved toward the door, Sarah stopped and looked back at Eli. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was small but steady. "Thank you for helping me." Eli nodded. "You're welcome, child." After they left, the saloon felt different somehow. The miners had gone back to their game, but they kept glancing at Eli. The cowboys were whispering to each other. The traveling salesman was staring at him openly. Eli walked back to the bar and picked up his whiskey. His hand was steady. It always was. Old Pete returned a few minutes later. "She's on her way home. Her wagon was just down the street." "Good." Pete poured himself a whiskey and drank it in one swallow. Then he looked at Eli. "That was well done. But you made enemies today." "I know. Dalton Reese rides with a gang. 8, maybe 10 men. They've been causing trouble across 3 territories. Robbing, stealing cattle, worse things. If you hurt his pride like that, he'll come back." "I know," Eli said again. "Why'd you do it then? Why get involved?" Eli thought about the question, thought about Thomas, about the badge, about the promise he'd made, thought about the look in Sarah Whitmore's eyes. "Because someone had to," he said simply, "and everyone else was looking away." Pete nodded slowly. "You're a good man, Eli McGraw. But good men die young in this territory. I'm 58, Pete. I'm not young anymore." "Then good men die hard," Pete said. "Same difference." Eli finished his whiskey and set the glass down. "I should get home. It's getting late." He walked out into the afternoon sun, climbed onto his wagon, and turned Rosie toward home. As he rode out of Silver Creek, he didn't look back, but he felt the weight of what he'd done settling on his shoulders like an old familiar coat. He'd broken his promise, not with a gun, true, but he'd used violence, even if only enough to stop worse violence. He'd stepped back into the world he'd tried to leave behind. And he knew, deep in his bones, that this wasn't the end of it. This was only the beginning. The ride home seemed longer than usual. Rosie plodded along the familiar road, while Eli sat with the reins loose in his hands, his mind working through what had happened. He'd kept his promise. Technically. He hadn't drawn his gun, hadn't fired a shot, hadn't killed anyone, but he'd used his skills, his training, the instincts he'd spent 5 years trying to let atrophy. The moment Dalton had reached for his gun, Eli's body had moved without thought, muscle memory taking over. He'd known exactly how to disarm the man, exactly how much force to use, exactly how to end the confrontation with minimal violence. That knowledge hadn't faded. If anything, it felt sharper now, honed by years of discipline and control. He was more dangerous now than he'd been at 25, because now he understood restraint. Now he knew exactly how much violence was necessary and how much was excess. That understanding troubled him more than he wanted to admit. The sun was sinking toward the western mountains when he reached his homestead. He unhitched Rosie, gave her water and hay, unloaded his supplies. The simple tasks helped settle his mind. This was his life now. Peaceful routine, honest work, the kind of existence Thomas would have wanted for him. But as he carried the flour and sugar into his house, he couldn't shake Pete's words. Dalton Reese rode with a gang. They'd be back. Eli had embarrassed their leader in front of witnesses. Men like that didn't forgive such things. They couldn't afford to. Not if they wanted to maintain their reputation. Inside, Eli lit a lamp against the gathering dusk and put his supplies away. He made himself a simple dinner: beans, cornbread left over from yesterday, coffee. He ate slowly, mechanically, tasting nothing. After dinner, he sat on his porch and watched night come to the valley. The stars emerged one by one, brilliant against the darkening sky. An owl called from somewhere in the pines. The creek made its constant music over smooth stones. This was what peace felt like. This quiet, this solitude, this connection to land and sky. He'd worked hard to build this life. He'd earned it with grief and guilt and a promise made over his brother's grave. But had he? Or had he just been hiding? The question came unbidden, unwelcome. He'd told himself for 5 years that he was choosing peace, that he was honoring Thomas's memory by refusing violence. But tonight, watching that girl's face, seeing everyone else look away, he'd felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. He'd felt like himself, his real self. Not the peaceful rancher he'd been trying to become, but the man he'd always been underneath. The man who couldn't stand by while the innocent suffered. The man Thomas had looked up to, even when he'd been trying to get Eli to see that there was more to life than being good with a gun. Thomas had died, standing up for what was right. And Eli had sworn off violence in his brother's name. But would Thomas have wanted that? Would Thomas have wanted his brother to look away while men terrorized a frightened girl? He didn't know. That was the truth of it. He didn't know what Thomas would have wanted, because Thomas was gone and couldn't tell him. Eli went inside when the night grew cold. He lay in his bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the house settle around him. Sleep came late and brought dreams of Thomas, not the way he'd looked in death, but alive, laughing, wearing his deputy's badge with pride. In the dream, Thomas was trying to tell him something important, but Eli couldn't hear the words. He woke before dawn, unrested. The eastern sky was just beginning to lighten. He made coffee, drank it on the porch, watched another sunrise. The world didn't care about his internal struggles. The sun rose regardless, the wind blew. The creek flowed, life continued. He was feeding the chickens when he heard a horse approaching. His hand went instinctively to his hip, found nothing there. He hadn't worn his gun in 5 years. It was wrapped in oilcloth in a box under his bed, cleaned and maintained but never carried. The rider came into view, Sheriff John Dawson, sitting heavy in his saddle, looking older than his 60 years. Dawson had been sheriff of Silver Creek for nearly 2 decades. He was honest, competent within his limits, but those limits were considerable. He'd been a good lawman once, but age and arthritis and too many hard years had worn him down. "Morning, Eli," Dawson called out, reining up near the chicken coop. "John, what brings you out this way?" Dawson dismounted with a grunt, favoring his right knee. "Heard about what happened yesterday at Pete's place. Thought I should come by, have a word." "Coffee?" "Wouldn't say no." They sat on Eli's porch, mugs in hand. Dawson took his time getting to the point, which was his way. He asked about the ranch, about the weather, about how Eli's garden was doing. Finally, he set his mug down and looked at Eli directly. "Pete told me what you did for the Whitmore girl. That was a good thing, right thing. But you made an enemy of Dalton Reese. You know who he is?" "Pete told me. Gang leader. Robbers, rustlers, worse." Dawson nodded. "They've hit 4 towns in the past 6 months. Always the same ride-in. Take what they want, hurt anyone who stands against them. Usually they move on quick, don't stay in one place. But Dalton's got pride. You hurt that pride yesterday. I know. He'll come back. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but he'll come. And when he does, there'll be violence." Eli sipped his coffee. "What would you have had me do, John? Let him terrorize that girl? No, God, no. What you did was right, but right doesn't always keep a man alive." Dawson leaned forward. "I'm getting too old for this, Eli. I can't face down a gang of killers. I've got 2 deputies' boys, really, neither one seen real trouble. If Dalton comes back with his whole gang, if there's shooting, I don't know if we can handle it." "What are you asking me?" "I'm asking if you'd pin on a badge again. Just temporary, until this blows over. You've got skills nobody else in this territory has. You could help me protect this town." There it was. The thing Eli had known was coming from the moment he'd stood up in that saloon. "I swore off that life," Eli said. 5 years ago, standing over Thomas's grave, I promised I'd never go back to it. I know, and I respect that promise. But sometimes life doesn't give us the choices we want. Sometimes we have to choose between what we want and what's needed. There's always a choice, John. Is there?" Dawson's eyes were tired but sharp. "You chose yesterday, chose to stand up, chose to help that girl. You think you can unchoose that now? You think Dalton's going to care that you want peace?" Eli had no answer to that, because Dawson was right. The moment he'd stood up in the Silver Queen, he'd made his choice. Everything that followed was consequence. "I need to think about it," Eli said. Dawson stood, joints creaking. "Fair enough, but don't think too long. Reese could be back any time." He paused at the steps. "For what it's worth, Eli, this town could use a man like you. Not the gun, the man, the kind who stands up when everyone else sits down. We need more of that. Less people looking away." After Dawson left, Eli sat alone with his thoughts. He went inside and opened the top drawer of his bureau. Thomas's badge lay there, tarnished silver catching the morning light. He picked it up, felt its weight in his palm. The dent where it had stopped a bullet was smooth under his thumb. He thought about putting it on, thought about what it would mean. Another promise broken, another step back into the life he'd tried to leave behind. But he also thought about Sarah Whitmore's face. about the way everyone had looked away, about the kind of man Thomas had been, a man who wore a badge because it meant standing between the innocent and those who would hurt them. Maybe that was what the badge really meant, not violence, not guns, but standing up, being counted, refusing to look away. Eli set the badge back in the drawer and closed it. He wasn't ready to make that decision yet. Maybe he never would be. But for now, he had work to do, animals to feed, fences to mend, a life to live, however complicated it had become. He went outside and lost himself in the familiar rhythms of ranch work, trying not to think about the choice that was coming, trying not to think about the men who might ride out of the morning with violence in their hearts and his name on their lips. 3 days passed. Eli kept to his routine, working his land, tending his animals, trying to find the peace that had come so easily before. But it was different now. He found himself listening for riders, watching the tree line, his body alert in ways it hadn't been in years. On the 4th day, a wagon came up his road in the late afternoon. Eli was repairing a section of fence when he heard it. He straightened, watching as the wagon approached. A man drove 50 or so, weathered face, work-hardened hands, with a woman beside him and a young girl in the back, Sarah Whitmore. Even at a distance, Eli recognized her. The man pulled the wagon to a stop near Eli's house. He climbed down, removed his hat, held it in both hands. His manner was respectful, careful. "Mr. McGraw, I'm Henry Whitmore. This is my wife, Margaret, and I believe you've met our daughter, Sarah." Eli set down his tools and walked over. "Mr. Whitmore, ma'am," he nodded. To each of them, then to Sarah. The girl's eyes were downcast, her face pink with embarrassment or shyness or both. "We wanted to come by and thank you proper," Henry said, "for what you did. Sarah told us everything. There's no need." "There's every need," Margaret Whitmore interrupted. She was a thin woman with strong features and eyes that had seen hardship. "That girl is our whole world. What those men might have done if you hadn't stood up." Her voice broke slightly. She steadied herself. "We owe you a debt." "You owe me nothing, ma'am. Any decent man would have done the same. But most didn't," Henry said quietly. "That's the truth of it. My Sarah was in a room full of men, and only one stood up. That means something." Sarah finally looked at Eli. Her eyes were clear today, no tears. "I wanted to say thank you myself, Mr. McGraw, not just for stopping those men, but for—" She paused, searching for words. "For making me feel like I mattered, like I was worth protecting. Most people look right through girls like me. We're just there, you know? But you made me feel like I was worth standing up for." The words hit Eli harder than he'd expected. This was why he'd done it. Not to be a hero, not to prove something about himself, but because a frightened girl had needed someone to see her as human, as worthy of dignity and safety. "You are worth it," Eli said. "Don't ever think otherwise. What happened wasn't about me being brave. It was about those men being wrong. You understand? They were wrong, and someone needed to say so." Sarah nodded, wiping at her eyes. "I understand." Margaret climbed down from the wagon carrying a covered basket. "We brought you some things. Preserves, bread, some dried venison. It's not much, but it's what we have." "That's very kind, but unnecessary. We need to do something," Henry said. "We're not rich people, Mr. McGraw. Don't have much to offer, but what we have, we share with friends. And, after what you did, we'd be honored if you'd consider us friends." Eli took the basket. The weight of it felt like more than food. It felt like connection, like community, like the thing he'd been missing in his solitary life. "I'd be honored," he said. They stayed for a short while, talking. Henry and Margaret ran a small farm, 10 miles south of Silver Creek. Hard scrabble work, barely making ends meet, but they owned their land free and clear. Sarah was their only child, born late in their marriage, the light of their lives. She was a good girl, helped her mother with the house, helped her father in the fields when needed. She'd been in town picking up supplies, something she'd done 100 times before without trouble. "Times are changing," Henry said. "Not for the better. Used to be a man could send his daughter into town without worrying. But now, with the mines closed and desperate men passing through, it's different. Harder. Sheriff Dawson came to see us," Margaret said. "Told us about Dalton Reese and his gang. Told us they might come back because of what you did." She looked at Eli directly. "We're afraid. Not for ourselves, we're old enough to take whatever comes. But for Sarah, if those men come back, if they're angry, they won't touch your daughter," Eli said. The certainty in his voice surprised even him. "I promise you that." "Sheriff says you won't take the badge," Henry said. "Says he asked, and you turned him down. I haven't given him an answer yet, but you're thinking no." Eli didn't respond. The silence was answer enough. Henry nodded slowly. "That's your right, of course. No man can be forced to wear a badge, but I'll tell you what I told the sheriff. This town needs you. Not your gun, though that wouldn't hurt, but your character. The kind of character that stands up instead of looking away. We got too many people looking away these days." After they left, Eli stood in his yard holding the basket and watching their wagon disappear down the road. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Beautiful, like every sunset, but somehow emptier now. He took the basket inside and unpacked it. Margaret Whitmore's preserves, her bread still warm, venison dried and seasoned with care, food made with love, given in gratitude. He ate his dinner that night from their gifts and tasted the difference between food eaten alone and food shared in friendship. That night, he took Thomas's badge from the drawer again, held it in his hand, studied it in the lamplight. Thomas had chosen this life, had chosen to stand between the innocent and the violent, had chosen it knowing it might cost him everything, and it had, but Thomas had never regretted the choice. Eli knew that. His brother had died believing in something bigger than himself, the idea that good men had an obligation to act, not just to think well or mean well, but to actually stand up and do something. Eli had spent 5 years telling himself he was honoring Thomas by choosing peace, but maybe he'd just been choosing the easier path. Peace was simple when you were alone on a ranch, when you didn't have to see Sarah Whitmore's face or hear her parents' fear. Peace was simple when you could look away. Thomas never looked away, and he died for it, but he'd also lived for it, really lived, with purpose and meaning and the knowledge that his life mattered, that his choices mattered, that he made a difference. What difference had Eli made in 5 years? He'd kept himself safe, kept his conscience clean, kept his promise to a dead man who couldn't tell him if the promise was even what he'd wanted. Eli set the badge on the small table beside his bed. He blew out the lamp and lay in the darkness, thinking. The next morning, he was up before dawn. He dressed carefully, putting on his good shirt, his good pants, his good boots. He shaved, looking at his reflection in the mirror. An old man looked back. Grey hair, lined face, tired eyes, but not too old. Not yet. He wrapped his gun belt in cloth and tucked it into his saddlebag. He'd told himself he wouldn't wear it, wouldn't become that man again, but he was practical enough to know he might need it. Better to have it and not need it than need it and not have it. He saddled Rosie and rode to Silver Creek as the sun was rising. The town was just waking up when he arrived. He tied Rosie outside the sheriff's office and went inside. John Dawson was at his desk, drinking coffee and reading through wanted posters. He looked up when Eli entered, surprise crossing his face. "Eli, didn't expect to see you. I've been thinking about what you said, about choices, about what's needed versus what's wanted." Dawson set down his coffee. "And I won't wear the badge," Eli said. "I made a promise to my brother and I mean to keep it. I'm not a lawman. Not anymore." Dawson's face fell. "I understand. Can't say I'm not disappointed, but I'll help," Eli continued. "Unofficial. When Dalton Reese comes back, and he will come back, I'll stand with you. I'll do what needs doing to protect this town." I just won't wear the badge while I do it. A slow smile spread across Dawson's face. That's all I can ask. More than I had any right to expect, truth be told. I have conditions, Eli said. I do this my way. I won't draw unless there's no other choice. And when it's done, when Reese and his gang are dealt with, I go back to my ranch, and you leave me in peace. No more requests. No more calls for help. I do this once, and then I'm done. Agreed. They shook hands. The deal was made. Eli McGraw was going back to the life he'd sworn off, at least for a while. At least until the threat was past, and the town was safe. He told himself it was temporary. He told himself he was still keeping his promise, in spirit if not in letter. He told himself that Thomas would understand, but deep down, he wondered if he was just lying to himself. If once you stepped back into violence, even for good reasons, you could ever really step away again. He'd find out soon enough. Dalton Reese was coming. And when he came, there'd be blood. The only question was whose. The first thing Eli did was scout the town. Not as a visitor passing through, but with the practiced eye of someone assessing defensible positions and potential ambush points. He walked Silver Creek's main street at different times of day, noting sightlines, cover, escape routes, old habits returning like an unwelcome friend. Sheriff Dawson watched him work with a mixture of relief and concern. You think they'll hit us directly? Right here in town? Depends on what Dalton wants, Eli said. They were standing outside the sheriff's office, watching afternoon traffic move past. If he just wants revenge on me, he'll come to my ranch. But if he wants to make a statement, show this town what happens when people stand against him, he'll come here. Which do you think he'll choose? The statement. Men like Dalton, their reputation is everything. I made him look weak in front of witnesses. He needs to show he's still dangerous, still someone to fear. He'll want an audience. Dawson rubbed his face tiredly. How do we prepare for that? We don't. Not fully. 8 to 10 men, you said? Against you, me, and 2 green deputies? The numbers aren't in our favor. So what do we do? Eli was quiet for a long moment. We make them think twice. We show enough strength that maybe they decide the cost isn't worth it. And if that doesn't work, we make sure the people of this town are as safe as possible when the shooting starts. Over the next few days, Eli worked with Dawson's deputies, young men named Billy Turner and James Chen. Billy was local, maybe 22, eager but untested. James was the son of Chinese immigrants who'd come to work the mines, smart and careful but lacking experience. Neither one had been in real trouble before. Eli didn't try to make them into something they weren't. He taught them simple things, how to take cover properly, how to reload under pressure, how to breathe through fear. He made them practice until their hands remembered the movements, even when their minds went blank with terror. You probably won't hit anything in a real fight, he told them honestly. First time you're under fire, your hands shake, your aim goes wild. That's normal. What matters is you don't freeze. You keep moving, keep thinking, stay alive long enough for help to reach you. What about you? Billy asked. Do you still get scared? Every time, Eli said. The day you stop being scared is the day you get careless. Fear keeps you sharp. You just learn to work through it. He also talked to the townspeople. Not speeches or warnings, but quiet conversations. With old Pete about the Silver Queen's thick walls and how many people could shelter there safely. With Doc Harlan about preparing his office. For wounded, about having supplies ready. With the pastor at the church about using the building as a secondary refuge if needed. You really think it'll come to that? The pastor asked. Reverend Michael Hayes was 40, earnest, a man who believed deeply in the power of prayer and peaceful resolution. I hope not, Eli said, but hope isn't a strategy. We prepare for the worst and pray for the best. Hayes studied him. Sheriff Dawson told me you won't wear the badge. Why help if you're not willing to take the oath? The oath isn't what matters. What matters is standing up when you're needed. But the badge represents something. Authority, law. The order that keeps civilization from descending into chaos. Maybe, Eli said, or maybe it's just a piece of metal. What really keeps chaos at bay isn't badges or laws. It's people choosing to do right, even when it's hard, even when it costs them something. Hayes smiled slightly. You sound like a preacher. God forbid. He might have other plans for you. Eli didn't respond to that. He'd stopped believing God had plans for anyone the day Thomas died. If there was a God, he kept his own counsel and let people work out their problems without much divine intervention. In the evenings, Eli returned to his ranch. The work was harder now because his mind was divided. Half of him focused on fence repairs and feeding animals. The other half ran through scenarios, outcomes, strategies. It was exhausting. On the 5th day, Margaret Whitmore came to visit. She arrived in the afternoon, driving her wagon alone. Eli was surprised it wasn't proper for a married woman to visit a man unchaperoned, even one old enough to be her father. She seemed to read his thoughts. I know it's not appropriate, she said as he helped her down from the wagon. But what I need to say isn't the sort of thing you say with an audience. They sat on his porch. Eli offered water, which she accepted gratefully. For a while, she just sat, looking out at the valley, working up to whatever she'd come to say. My Sarah can't sleep, she finally said. Every night, she wakes up crying. Dreams about those men coming back, about what might have happened if you hadn't been there. Margaret turned to face him. The doctor in town, he gave us some medicine to help her sleep. But medicine doesn't fix fear, does it? No, ma'am, it doesn't. Henry says we should leave, pack up, move to his brother's place in Utah. Leave Silver Creek behind, but this is our home. We built our life here. Our land, our house, my daughter's whole childhood, it's all here. Leaving would feel like letting those men win. Like they took more from us than just Sarah's peace of mind. Eli understood. Running never solved anything. It just moved the problem to a new location. Sheriff Dawson says you're preparing for when they come back, Margaret continued, that you're getting ready to face them. Is that true? Yes, ma'am. Will you kill them? The question was direct, unflinching. Eli respected that. I'll do what needs doing to protect this town. Nothing more, nothing less. That's not an answer. It's the only answer I have. Margaret nodded slowly. I'm not a violent person, Mr. McGraw. I was raised Quaker, taught that all life is sacred, that violence only begets more violence. I still believe that, mostly. But I also believe that evil exists in this world. And sometimes good people have to stand against it with more than just words and prayers. She looked at him directly. If you have to kill those men to keep my daughter safe, to keep this town safe, then I won't judge you for it. And I'll thank you for having the courage to do what needs doing. After she left, Eli sat alone on his porch for a long time. He thought about courage, about violence, about the difference between killing and murder. He thought about Thomas, who died defending people he barely knew because that's what the badge required. He thought about his promise, already bent if not broken. That night, he unwrapped his gun from the oilcloth. The Colt Peacemaker was exactly as he'd left it 5 years ago, cleaned, oiled, maintained. He held it in his hand, felt its familiar weight. The gun didn't judge. It didn't care about his promises or his doubts. It was just a tool, neutral as a hammer, its morality determined entirely by the hand that wielded it. He strapped the gun belt around his waist. The leather was stiff from disuse but still serviceable. The gun sat on his hip like it belonged there, like it had never left. He drew, not fast, not trying to impress anyone, just a smooth, practiced motion. The gun cleared leather, his thumb cocking the hammer as it came level. Empty, of course. He hadn't loaded it yet. But the motion was still there, burned into muscle memory deeper than conscious thought. He holstered the gun, drew again, and again, working through the rust, feeling his body remember what his mind had, tried to forget. After an hour, his shoulder ached and his hand cramped, but the draw was smooth again, fast again, reliable again. He could hit what he aimed at, always had been able to, always would be able to. Some skills didn't fade. He loaded the gun with practiced efficiency. 6 rounds, hammer resting on an empty chamber for safety. Then he sat on his porch wearing the gun, feeling like himself and like a stranger simultaneously. The quiet gun, that's what they'd called him. Not because he was silent, but because he didn't need to threaten or boast. His presence was threat enough. His reputation did the talking. That reputation had bought him 5 years of peace, but now he was spending it, cashing it in for one more fight, one more time standing between the innocent and those who would hurt them. He hoped it would be enough. He hoped the cost wouldn't be too high. But hoping, as he'd told Reverend Hayes, wasn't a strategy. The only strategy was preparation. The only path was forward. The only choice was the one he'd already made. Dalton Reese was coming, and Eli McGraw would be ready. Word spread through Silver Creek that Eli McGraw was wearing his gun again. People noticed. Some took comfort in it. Others worried about what it meant. On the 7th day after the incident at the saloon, Eli was in town helping reinforce the sheriff's office windows when a familiar face appeared. Doc Harlan, medical bag in hand, looking troubled. "Eli, might I have a word?" They stepped outside into the afternoon sun. Doc Harlan was 65, silver-haired, with steady hands and kind eyes. He'd been the town doctor for 30 years, had delivered most of the children currently growing up in Silver Creek, including Sarah Whitmore. "I saw the Whitmore girl this morning," Doc said. "She's not sleeping, barely eating. The trauma of what happened, it's affecting her more than her parents realize. I'm sorry to hear that. Are you?" Doc studied him. "Because, from where I stand, you're preparing for more trauma, more violence. You're getting ready to add to the damage, not heal it." Eli leaned against the porch rail. "You think I should let Dalton Reese ride back into town unopposed? Let him do whatever he wants? I think violence begets violence. I think the moment you strapped that gun back on, you made this fight inevitable. Before, maybe Dalton would have let it go, moved on to easier prey. Now he knows you're ready for him. He can't back down without looking weak. He was never going to back down, Doc. Men like that don't. Maybe. Or maybe we'll never know, because we didn't give peace a chance." Doc sighed. "I'm not naive, Eli. I know sometimes violence is necessary. I've patched up enough gunshot wounds, set enough bones from bar fights. I know what this world is. But I also know you. I knew you before, when you were the quiet gun. And I saw what that life did to you, how it hollowed you out inside, how relieved you were when you finally walked away from it. Thomas didn't get to walk away. No, he didn't. And I mourned him. Still do. But Thomas chose that life with open eyes. He knew the risks. He wore the badge because he believed in law, in order, in something bigger than himself. What are you doing this for, Eli? Justice, or vengeance dressed up as justice?" The question hit harder than Doc probably intended, because Eli had been asking himself the same thing. Was this about protecting the town? Or was it about the satisfaction he'd felt when he'd taken Dalton down, the rush of being good at something again, being needed again? "I don't know," Eli admitted. "Maybe both. Maybe I'm fooling myself. But that girl was terrified, Doc. Everyone else looked away. If I'd looked away too, what does that make me? What does that make any of us?" "Human," Doc said. "Flawed. Afraid. Same as everyone else." He put a hand on Eli's shoulder. "I'm not saying what you did was wrong. I'm saying be careful that what you do next doesn't become the very thing you're fighting against. Violence for a good cause is still violence. And violence has a way of consuming the people who wield it." After Doc left, Eli returned to his work, but the conversation stayed with him. He'd always known violence was a tool with a cost. The question was whether the cost was worth what it bought you. Thomas had thought so, had died thinking so. But Thomas had also been young, idealistic, certain about right and wrong in a way Eli had never managed. That evening, as Eli was preparing to head back to his ranch, old Pete called him over to the Silver Queen. "Got something to show you," Pete said. In the back room of the saloon, Pete pulled out a dusty box. Inside were 2 shotguns, both well-maintained, and several boxes of shells. "Had these since the boom days," Pete explained. "Kept them in case of trouble with drunk miners. Never had to use them, thank God. but if there's going to be shooting in my place, I'd rather be armed than not. You know how to use these? I'm 70, not helpless. I can aim and pull a trigger. That's most of what matters at close range. Eli checked the shotguns. Both were in good working order. These will do. But Pete, if it comes to shooting, you get behind the bar and stay there. These men are killers. This isn't like breaking up a bar fight. I know what they are. I also know what I am, a stubborn old man who's spent 40 years building this business. I'm not letting some gang of thugs tear it apart without a fight. Eli understood. Everyone had their line, the point where they stopped retreating and stood their ground. For some, it came early, for others, later. But everyone had it. Over the next few days, Eli found himself becoming part of the community in ways he hadn't been in years. People stopped him on the street to talk, thanked him, asked questions about what would happen when Reese came back. He gave honest answers when he could, reassuring ones when honesty seemed too harsh. Henry Whitmore showed up at the sheriff's office with 3 other farmers, all carrying rifles. "We heard you might need help," Henry said. "We're not fighters, but we can shoot. Grew up hunting. We can hit what we aim at, long as it's not moving too fast." Sheriff Dawson looked at Eli, who studied the men. They were in their 40s and 50s, work-hardened, sober, steady. Not trained fighters, but not cowards either. "When it starts, you take positions on the rooftops," Eli told them. "You don't move until I give the signal. And if things go wrong, if we lose control of the situation, you get to safety. Your families need you alive more than this town needs you dead," they agreed. 4 more guns, 4 more men willing to stand instead of run. It wasn't much, but it was something. That night, alone at his ranch, Eli practiced his draw again. Faster now, smoother. His body remembered everything, the stance, the breath control, the way your whole body participated in the motion, not just your hand. It was like riding a horse or swimming, once learned, never fully forgotten. He thought about what Doc Harlan had said, about violence consuming the people who wielded it. He thought about the 5 years he'd spent trying to be someone else, someone better, someone who didn't carry death at his hip. But he also thought about Sarah Whitmore's face, about Margaret Whitmore's quiet courage in asking him to protect her daughter, about Henry and his friends, farmers willing to risk everything for their community. These were good people. They deserved protection. They deserved someone willing to stand between them and violence, even if that someone had to become violent themselves. Maybe that was the paradox Doc didn't want to face. Sometimes the only way to protect the innocent was to be willing to do terrible things. The key was doing those things without becoming terrible yourself, walking that line between necessary violence and unnecessary cruelty. Eli had walked that line before. He'd killed 6 men to avenge his brother, but he'd killed them in fair combat, face to face, giving each a chance. He hadn't tortured them, hadn't made them suffer beyond what was needed. He'd ended it clean. He could walk that line again. He had to believe that. A week had passed since the incident at the saloon. Every day, Eli expected to see riders coming. Every night, he slept light, his gun within reach. The waiting was its own kind of torture, the anticipation worse than the event itself. But he'd learned patience over the years, learned that the world moved at its own pace, indifferent to human urgency. Dalton would come when he came. Until then, all Eli could do was prepare and wait and try to hold on to the parts of himself that made the violence worth it. On the 8th day, a stranger rode into Silver Creek. Young man, maybe 25, with the dust of hard travel on his clothes. He stopped. At the Silver Queen, had a drink, asked questions about the town, about the law, about a man named Eli McGraw. Billy Turner, who'd been nursing a beer at the bar, heard the questions and reported back to Sheriff Dawson. Dawson found Eli at his ranch that evening. "Scout," Eli said when Dawson told him. "Reese sent someone ahead to gather information. He's planning something, probably coming within the next few days. How do you want to handle it?" We don't. We let him gather his information and ride back. Let Reese think he knows what he's walking into, but we'll be ready for him. And what he finds won't be what he expects." Dawson nodded. "You've done this before. Face down gangs. Long time ago. Different life. But you remember how." "Unfortunately," Eli said, "some things you never forget, no matter how much you wish you could." That night, Eli sat on his porch and watched the stars. The peace he'd built here felt fragile now, temporary, like a glass house about to be shattered. Part of him mourned it already, but another part, the part he'd tried to bury, felt alive again, alert, purposeful. He'd made his choice. Now he'd live with the consequences, whatever they were. The storm was coming, and Eli McGraw stood at its center, one old man with a gun and a conscience, trying to protect people who couldn't protect themselves, trying to be both the violence and the barrier against it. Trying to be the kind of man Thomas would have been proud of, even as he did things Thomas would never have needed to do. The stars offered no judgment. They just shone, cold and distant and beautiful. The world kept turning, and somewhere out there, Dalton Reese was coming with blood on his mind and murder in his heart. Eli would be ready. On the 10th day, the stranger rode out of Silver Creek heading north. Eli watched him go from a second-story window above the general store. The young man looked back once, studying the town, then spurred his horse, and Bex disappeared into the tree line. "Now we wait," Sheriff Dawson said beside him. "How long you think?" 2, maybe 3 days. He needs to report back. They need to make their plan. But not much longer than that. Reese has waited long enough." Eli was right. 2 days later, just after dawn, Billy Turner came running to the sheriff's office, where Eli was reviewing defensive positions with Dawson. "Riders," Billy gasped, out of breath. 8 of them, coming up the south road. Still a few miles out. Eli felt his pulse quicken, then forced it to slow. This was it. The moment all the preparation had been leading toward. "Get everyone to their positions," he told Dawson. "Exactly like we planned. And Billy, tell Doc Harlan to prepare his office. We're going to need him." The town moved with surprising efficiency. The farmers took their positions on rooftops. Old Pete armed himself behind his bar. Families with children moved to the church, where Reverend Hayes waited to shelter them. In less than 30 minutes, Silver Creek had transformed from a sleepy frontier town into something resembling a fortress. Eli stood on the main street, visible, waiting. He'd positioned himself carefully in front of the sheriff's office, with clear sightlines in every direction, cover close at hand if needed. Sheriff Dawson stood beside him, rifle in hand. James Chen was on the roof of the general store with a rifle. Billy Turner watched from the hotel window. The 8 riders came into view at the south end of town. They rode slowly, deliberately, spread out in a line, making a statement, showing they weren't afraid. Dalton Reese was in the center, easy to recognize even from a distance. Eli studied the others. Hard men, all of them, killers and thieves. But as they got closer, Eli noticed something that made his blood run cold. The man to Dalton's right, slightly older than the others, with gray in his beard and a scar across his left cheek. Eli knew that face. Had seen it 5 years ago through the smoke of gunfire, falling backward with a bullet in his chest. Cade Brennan, the man who'd killed Thomas. Eli had shot him that night, had watched him fall, had been certain he was dead. The whole gang had been dead when Eli had ridden away from that camp. He'd checked each body carefully. He'd been sure. But here, Cade Brennan was, riding into Silver Creek like a ghost returning from hell. The riders stopped about 50 feet away. Dalton dismounted, his men following suit. They spread out slightly, hands near their guns but not touching them. Yet, "McGraw," Dalton called out. His voice was still raspy from where Eli had struck his throat. "We need to talk." "There's nothing to talk about," Eli said. His voice was steady despite the shock coursing through his system. "You and your men turn around and ride out. Don't come back. That's the only conversation worth having." Dalton laughed. You don't recognize him, do you? My lieutenant here. My second in command. He gestured to Brennan. Cade, say hello to your old friend. Cade. Brennan stepped forward, grinning. Hello, Eli. Been a long time. Heard you thought you killed me that night. Almost did. Bullet missed my heart by about 2 inches. Broke some ribs, punctured a lung. I was out for 3 days. By the time I came to, you were gone, and my boys were all dead. Eli's mind raced. He'd been so certain. But he'd been wild with grief that night, methodical in his killing, but not as careful as he should have been in confirming the dead. He'd made a mistake, and that mistake had let Thomas's killer walk free. I spent a year recovering, Brennan continued. A year thinking about you, about what you took from me, my gang, my reputation. My health, I still can't breathe right when the weather turns cold. So I rebuilt, found new men, and I found Dalton here. Told him about you, about the quiet gun, about how you needed to be taught a lesson. This was all about me, Eli said. Everything that happened at the saloon was bait, Dalton said, pure and simple. We knew you lived near Silver Creek, knew you'd sometimes come to town. We just needed something that would make you stand up. That little girl was convenient. Pretty thing, really. Shame you interrupted before we could have more fun with her. The casual cruelty of it made Eli's hands tighten into fists. They'd orchestrated the whole thing, used Sarah as bait to draw him out. Everything since had been planned, the scout, the waiting, giving Eli time to prepare, because they wanted this, wanted the confrontation, wanted the audience. Cade told me you were good, Dalton said. Said you were the fastest draw he'd ever seen. Said you moved like death itself. I didn't believe him. Thought he was making excuses for getting beaten by an old man. But then I saw you in the saloon, saw how you moved, and I realized Cade was right. You're something special. What do you want, Dalton? I want you to draw on me, right here, right now. Fair fight, you and me. If you win, my men ride out and never come back. If I win, when I win, this town burns. Every building, every house, everyone who stood with you dies. Starting with that little girl and her family. Behind him, Eli heard Dawson's sharp intake of breath. This was the trap. Refuse the challenge, and Dalton would tear Silver Creek apart. Accept it, and Eli's death would leave the town defenseless anyway. And if I kill you? Eli asked. You think your men will honor that deal? They will, Cade Brennan said, because I'll make them. I want you dead, McGraw, but I want it done right. Fair fight. Prove that you're not as good as everyone says. Prove that you're just a man, not some legend. Kill you that way, take away your reputation before we take away your life. Eli understood then. This wasn't about Sarah Whitmore or Silver Creek. This was about ego, about 2 men who needed to prove something to themselves and the fine world. Dalton needed to be the man who killed the quiet gun. Cade needed revenge for his dead gang and his wounded pride, and they were willing to destroy an entire town to get it. Before I accept, Eli said, I need to know something. Thomas McGraw, 5 years ago, you shot him in Silver Creek. Was that planned too? Was he bait for me? Cade shook his head. That was real. We robbed the bank. He tried to stop us. I shot him because he was in the way. Finding out later that he was your brother, that was just luck. Good luck for me, bad luck for you. But you used it, Eli said. Knew I'd come after you, counted on it. Didn't count on you being as good as you were. Didn't think you'd kill all 6 of my best men in one night. That was impressive. Terrifying, but impressive. Sheriff Dawson stepped forward. This is insane. Eli, you don't have to do this. We can fight them together. We've got men positioned. And how many will die? Eli asked quietly. How many farmers with families? How many young deputies who've never been in real combat? We might win, probably would win. But the cost is worth it if it means you don't have to sacrifice yourself. That's not your decision to make, John. Eli looked at the 8 men standing before him. Hard faces, killer's eyes, Men who'd done terrible things and would do worse if given the chance. Behind him, he felt the weight of the town. The farmers on rooftops, old Pete in his saloon, Sarah Whitmore in the church with her parents. All the people who'd trusted him to protect them. He thought about Thomas, about the badge, about the promise he'd made and broken a dozen different ways over the past 2 weeks. Maybe this was how he kept it after all. One last act of violence to buy peace for others. One death, his or Dalton's, to prevent many. "I accept your challenge," Eli said. "But I want your word, Brennan, in front of witnesses. If I win, you and your men leave and never come back. You swear that, on whatever you hold sacred." Cade Brennan nodded. "You have my word. If you kill Dalton, we ride out. But McGraw, you won't win. Dalton's young, fast, practiced. You're old, Rusty. You might have been the quiet gun once, but that was a long time ago. Today, you're just an old man playing at being a hero." "Maybe," Eli said. "Let's find out." The street cleared. Dawson retreated reluctantly to the sidewalk. The farmers held their positions but didn't fire. This was Eli's choice, Eli's fight. Eli and Dalton faced each other from 20 paces. The morning sun cast long shadows down the dusty street. Somewhere, a door creaked. Someone coughed. The normal sounds of a town holding its breath. Eli felt strangely calm. This was familiar territory. This moment, this test, he'd lived it before, survived it before. Maybe Cade was right. Maybe he was too old, too rusty. Maybe the young, fast gunfighter would put him in the ground. But Eli had one advantage. Dalton didn't. Eli didn't want to be here. Didn't want this fight. Didn't care about reputation or proving anything. He was here because innocent people needed protecting. And a man fighting for others always had more to draw on than a man fighting for himself. "Whenever you're ready," Dalton said. His hand hovered over his gun. "Make your move, old man." Eli didn't move, didn't blink, just stood there, relaxed, waiting. This was the part young gunfighters never understood. It wasn't about who drew first. It was about who was still standing when the smoke cleared. Dalton's hand twitched, and everything changed. Dalton's hand dropped toward his gun. Fast, faster than Eli had expected. The young man had skill, no question. His draw was smooth, practiced, the motion of someone who'd done it hundreds of times. But Eli had done it thousands. The Colt came up in Eli's hand as if by its own will. No thought, no hesitation, just muscle memory and decades of experience compressed into a single fluid motion. His thumb cocked the hammer. His finger found the trigger. The sight aligned with Dalton's chest. Both guns fired simultaneously. The sound split the morning air like thunder. Dalton's shot went wide, kicking up dust 3 feet to Eli's left. Eli's shot took him center mass, exactly where Eli had aimed. Dalton stumbled backward, his gun falling from his hand. He looked down at the spreading red stain on his shirt with an expression of surprise, as if he couldn't quite believe what had happened. Then he collapsed. For a moment, nobody moved. The echo of gunfire faded. Smoke drifted on the light breeze. Dalton lay in the street, gasping, dying. Cade Brennan stared at Eli with an expression that mixed shock and grudging respect. "Jesus," he said quietly. "Cade was right. You really are that good." Eli kept his gun up, aimed at Brennan's chest. "We had a deal. Your man lost. You ride out." "I know what the deal was." Brennan looked at his men, who were tense, hands on their guns but not drawing. "Stand down," he told them. "All of you. We gave our word." "Cade," one of them started. "I said stand down." Brennan's voice carried absolute authority. The men obeyed, hands moving away from their weapons. Eli didn't lower his gun. "You could have killed me yourself 5 years ago when you shot Thomas. Could have finished the job when I came after you. Why do it this way? Why the elaborate setup?" Brennan walked slowly toward Dalton's body. He knelt beside the dying man, checked his pulse, shook his head. "Because killing isn't always about the killing. Sometimes it's about the story, the legend. You've lived in people's minds for 15 years as the quiet gun, the man nobody could beat. I wanted to prove that wasn't true. Wanted witnesses to see you fall, but I didn't fall. No, you didn't. Brennan stood, his face unreadable. Question is, what happens now? Deal was, we ride out if you won, but part of me is still angry. Still wants revenge for my boys you killed. For the year I spent barely able to breathe, for everything you cost me. Sheriff Dawson had moved closer, rifle ready. Billy and James had also emerged, their weapons trained on Brennan's men. The farmers on the rooftops had clear shots. One wrong move, and this would turn into a massacre. You can try, Eli said. His voice was steady, his gun unwavering. But you saw how fast I am. You saw what happened to Dalton. You really think you're faster, more skilled? He was young, practiced, confident. And he's dead. What makes you think you'd fare any better? Brennan was silent for a long moment. Eli could see the war playing out behind his eyes. Pride versus survival, vengeance versus wisdom. Finally, something in Brennan's expression shifted. He relaxed slightly, a man making peace with a decision he didn't like but could live with. My boys are dead because they weren't good enough, Brennan said. I got shot because I wasn't good enough. Dalton's dead because he wasn't good enough. Maybe, he paused, the admission clearly costing him something. Maybe that's not on you. Maybe that's just how this life works. The good ones survive. The rest, well, they end up like Dalton. So you'll honor the deal? I gave my word. Brennan looked at his men. Mount up. We're leaving. What about Dalton? One of them asked. Leave him. He lost the fight. That makes him the town's problem now. Brennan turned back to Eli. But McGraw, someday, somewhere, if our paths cross again, I might decide to test myself against you. See if I'm good enough. Just so you know. I'll be ready, Eli said. Brennan nodded, then mounted his horse. His men followed suit. They turned north and rode out of Silver Creek at a walk, not hurrying, not showing fear, just leaving, as they'd promised. Eli kept his gun up until they were out of sight. Only then did he lower it, his hand suddenly shaking from adrenaline he hadn't allowed himself to feel during the confrontation. Doc. Harlan came running from his office. He went straight to Dalton, checked him, shook his head. He's gone, clean shot through the heart. He probably didn't feel much. Eli holstered his gun. The street was filling with people, now farmers coming down from rooftops, families emerging from the church, townspeople who'd been hiding in houses and businesses. They all stared at Eli with a mixture of awe, gratitude, and something else. Fear, maybe, or respect that bordered on fear. Sarah Whitmore broke free from her parents and ran to Eli. Before he could react, she threw her arms around him, sobbing against his chest. Thank you so much. You saved us. You saved everyone. Eli stood awkwardly, unused to such displays. He patted her shoulder gently. It's over, Sarah. You're safe now. Margaret and Henry Whitmore approached more slowly. Margaret's eyes were wet with tears. Henry extended his hand, which Eli shook. We can never repay you, Henry said. Never. You put your life on the line for us, for our daughter, for this town. That's the act of a true hero, Mr. McGraw. I'm no hero, Eli said. I'm just a man who did what needed doing. But even as he said it, he felt the weight of what had happened settling on his shoulders. He'd killed a man, again, had taken a life, ended someone's existence permanently. Yes, it had been in a fair fight. Yes, Dalton had been a killer who would have hurt innocent people. But the man was still dead, and Eli had been the one to kill him. Sheriff Dawson clasped Eli's shoulder. You did good, my friend. Better than good. You saved this town. If you hadn't stood up, if you hadn't agreed to that fight, we'd all be dead or worse. The crowd was pressing closer now, everyone wanting to thank Eli, to touch him, to be part of the story they'd just witnessed. It was overwhelming, suffocating. Eli needed space, needed air, needed to be alone with his thoughts. Excuse me, he said, gently extracting himself from Sarah's embrace. I need a moment. He walked to the edge of town, past the last building, to where the road led north into the pine forest. He stood there, breathing, trying to process everything that had happened. Behind him, he heard footsteps. Reverend Hayes approached, his expression somber. "Are you all right?" the Reverend asked. "I killed a man. You stopped a killer, protected the innocent. That's not the same thing, isn't it? A man is dead by my hand. That's the reality. Everything else is justification." Hayes was quiet for a moment. "I won't tell you that taking a life is easy to live with. It's not. It shouldn't be. The day it becomes easy is the day we lose our humanity. But I will tell you this, what you did was necessary. Evil exists in this world, Mr. McGraw. Real evil, not just misguided people or unfortunate circumstances. Sometimes the only way to stop evil is with force. That doesn't make the force evil, it makes it necessary." "My brother believed that," Eli said. "Wore a badge because he believed good men had an obligation to stand against evil. But it got him killed. And you avenged him. 5 years ago, you hunted down the men who killed him. That must have felt like justice." "It felt like murder," Eli said quietly. "Justified murder, maybe. Necessary murder. But murder all the same. I killed 6 men that night, took their lives with my own hands, and I told myself it was for Thomas, for justice. But part of me, the part I'm not proud of, part of me enjoyed it. The power, the skill, being good at something. That's what scared me. That's why I walked away and swore never to go back. But you did go back. You put on the gun again. Stood in that street. Why?" "Because," Eli paused, trying to find the words, "because looking away is its own kind of violence. Letting evil happen when you could stop it, that's choosing the side of evil, even if you tell yourself you're just being neutral. And I can't be that person. Can't be the man who lets a frightened girl get hurt because standing up might be dangerous." Hayes smiled sadly. "Then you understand. Violence in defense of the innocent isn't the same as violence for its own sake. The gun doesn't make you evil, Mr. McGraw. It's just a tool. What matters is the heart of the man holding it. And your heart, troubled as it is, conflicted as you are, your heart is good. I see that. This town sees that. God sees that. I'm not sure I believe in God anymore. That's all right. He believes in you." After Hayes left, Eli remained standing at the edge of town. The sun had climbed higher, warming the morning air. Behind him, he could hear the sounds of Silver Creek, returning to normal people talking, children laughing, the ordinary music of life continuing. Dalton's body was being moved. Doc Harlan would prepare it for burial. Sheriff Dawson would record the incident in his official reports. The town would go on, as towns always did. The drama of this morning eventually fading into story, then legend, then half-forgotten history. But for Eli, it would never fade. He'd carry this morning with him forever, another mark on his soul, another weight added to the burden he already carried. He thought about Thomas's badge, still sitting in his drawer at home. He'd told Dawson he wouldn't wear it, wouldn't become a lawman again. Maybe it wasn't about authority or violence or killing in the name of justice. Maybe it was simpler than that. Maybe it was just about standing up when others sat down, about being counted when it mattered most. Eli turned and walked back into town. People parted for him, giving him space, respecting his need for distance. He went to the sheriff's office where Dawson was writing his report. "John," Eli said, "that offer you made, about wearing the badge, is it still open?" Dawson looked up, surprise evident in his face. "Of course, but I thought too, thought I knew what I wanted, what I could handle, what promises I needed to keep, but I was wrong, about a lot of things. Thomas didn't die because of the badge. He died because evil exists, and sometimes good men have to face it down. The badge is just a symbol of that commitment, of saying, I won't look away. That's all it is. And I can live with that. I think I have to live with that." Dawson opened his desk drawer and pulled out a silver deputy's badge. Not Thomas's, that one was still at Eli's ranch. But similar, a simple piece of metal that meant everything and nothing, depending on the man who wore it. "Raise your right hand," Dawson said. Eli did. "Do you swear to uphold the law, protect the innocent, and serve the people of this territory to the best of your ability, so help you God?" Eli thought about all the things he'd done, all the promises he'd made and broken, all the violence he'd committed, and would probably commit again. He thought about Thomas, about Sarah Whitmore, about choosing to stand when sitting would be easier. "I do," he said. Dawson pinned the badge to Eli's shirt. It caught the light from the window, gleaming silver against the worn fabric. "Welcome back, Deputy McGraw," Dawson said, extending his hand. Eli shook it, feeling the weight of the badge on his chest. It felt right somehow, heavy but right, like coming home to a place you'd never really left. The rest of that day passed in a blur. People kept coming to thank Eli, to shake his hand, to tell him how grateful they were. He accepted their thanks with quiet grace, uncomfortable with the attention, but understanding it was necessary for them. They needed to express their gratitude, needed to process what had happened, needed to see him as human, despite the almost supernatural skill he'd displayed. By late afternoon, Eli was exhausted. Not from physical exertion, but from the emotional weight of constant interaction, of being seen, of being the center of attention. He'd spent 5 years avoiding exactly this, and now it was everywhere he turned. Old Pete found him sitting alone on a bench outside the general store, watching the sun sink toward the western mountains. "Figured you might need this," Pete said, handing him a glass of whiskey. "Thanks." Eli drank, felt the warmth spread through his chest. "It's a lot. The attention. You're a hero. People need heroes. Especially out here, where life is hard and safety is never guaranteed. You gave them something to believe in. I just killed a man, Pete. That's not heroic. That's just sad." Pete sat down beside him. "You know what I've learned in 70 years? Life is complicated. Things can be sad and necessary at the same time. That boy you killed, Dalton, he chose his path, made his choices. You didn't make them for him. You just responded to what he brought to your door. Doesn't make him less dead. No, but it makes you less responsible for that death. He drew on you. He forced the confrontation. What were you supposed to do? Let him kill you? Let him burn down the town? Sometimes there are no good choices, Eli, just less bad ones." They sat in comfortable silence, drinking, watching the light change. Other people passed by, nodded to them, left them alone. The town was settling, finding its rhythm again. Life continuing despite the violence, because of the violence around the violence. Sarah Whitmore appeared, walking with her mother. When she saw Eli, she approached hesitantly. "Mr. McGraw, may I speak with you for a moment?" Eli nodded. Margaret gave her daughter a supportive smile and continued on toward their wagon. Sarah sat where Pete had been. The old man had quietly excused himself. She folded her hands in her lap, gathering her thoughts. "I wanted to tell you something," she said. "Something I couldn't say in front of everyone else. When those men were bothering me in the saloon, when everyone else looked away, I felt so alone, so invisible, like I didn't matter enough for anyone to care. And then you stood up. You saw me. Not just my fear, but me. Like I was a person worth protecting, worth risking something for." She looked at him directly. "You gave me back my dignity, Mr. McGraw. That's worth more than you know. You never lost your dignity, Sarah. Those men tried to take it, but dignity isn't something that can be taken, only given away. And you didn't give it away. You stayed strong." I was terrified. Being terrified and staying strong aren't opposites. Sometimes they're the same thing. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's being afraid and not letting that fear make you less than who you are. Sarah smiled through tears. "My mama says you're wearing a badge now, that you're a deputy. For now, until the town doesn't need me anymore. Will that ever happen? People needing you?" Eli didn't have an answer to that. He'd thought he could walk away from this life, from being the person others turned to when trouble came. But maybe that was who he was, who he'd always been. Not because of his skill with a gun, but because of something deeper, the inability to stand by while others suffered. "I don't know," he finally said, "but I'll do what I can, for as long as I can. That's all any of us can do." After Sarah left, Eli remained on the bench, watching darkness claim the valley. Stars emerged one by one, the same stars that had shone over his ranch every night, the same stars that had watched him make his promise to Thomas, the same stars that watched him break it and remake it and break it again. Thomas would understand, Eli thought. His brother had always understood that life was messy, that good intentions weren't always enough, that sometimes you had to compromise your ideals to protect what mattered most. Thomas had worn the badge knowing it might cost him his life, had worn it anyway because the alternative, looking away, letting evil flourish, was worse than any personal risk. Eli touched the badge on his chest. It was cool metal, nothing more, but it represented something larger, a commitment, a promise. Not to be perfect, not to never make mistakes, but to stand up, to be counted, to refuse to look away. That was a promise he could keep. That was a promise worth keeping. He stood and walked back to where Rosie was tied, time to go home, to his ranch, his quiet valley, his simple life. Tomorrow he'd return to town, start learning what it meant to be a deputy again after all these years. But tonight, he needed his own space, his own silence. The ride home was peaceful. The night air was cool, fragrant with pine and sage. The moon was rising, casting silver light across the familiar landscape. Everything looked the same as it had this morning, but everything felt different. Eli had changed. Again. Become someone new, or perhaps returned to who he'd always been. The quiet gun, yes, but more than that. A man who stood up, a man who refused to look away, a man who wore the weight of his choices and kept moving forward anyway. That was enough. It had to be enough. Because tomorrow would bring its own challenges, its own choices, its own weights to carry. And Eli would face them the only way he knew how, with eyes open, conscience troubled, but feet firmly planted. Standing when others sat, acting when others froze, being the man his brother had believed he could be. When Eli reached his ranch, he didn't go straight inside. Instead, he sat on his porch, letting the night settle around him. The familiar sounds, creek water, wind through pines, the occasional call of a nightbird worked their quiet magic, easing the tension from his shoulders. He thought about the day's events with the clarity that comes after the adrenaline fades, the showdown, the killing, the badge. Each moment stood out sharp and clear, already beginning the transformation. From memory into story, from experience into something he'd carry forever. He'd been faster than Dalton. That wasn't a surprise. Not really. Eli had decades of experience, muscle memory honed by thousands of draws. But what struck him now was how easily it had come back. 5 years away from violence, 5 years telling himself he was someone different, and his body had moved without hesitation. The old skills, the old reflexes they'd been waiting just beneath the surface, ready. That realization troubled him. Because if the skills came back that easily, what did that say about his transformation? Had he really changed in 5 years, or had he just been pretending, putting on the costume of a peaceful rancher while the gunfighter waited underneath? He went inside and lit a lamp. The small house felt emptier than usual. Or maybe he just felt the emptiness more acutely now, after a day surrounded by people, by community, by connection. He opened the drawer beside his bed and took out Thomas's badge, held it next to the new badge on his chest, 2 pieces of silver, nearly identical, representing the same commitment, separated by 5 years and a lifetime of grief. Thomas had been so certain about everything, about right and wrong, about duty, about what it meant to be a good man. He'd worn his badge with pride, never doubted his choices, never questioned whether he was doing the right thing. That certainty had gotten him killed, but it had also given his life meaning and purpose. Eli had never had that certainty. Even when he'd been the quiet gun, even when his reputation had spread across 3 territories, he'd always felt the weight of his choices. Always questioned whether violence, even justified violence, was something to be proud of. Maybe that's what made him different from men like Dalton Reese. Not skill or speed, but conscience. The unwillingness to take killing lightly, to treat it as anything other than the terrible, final thing it was. He placed Thomas's badge back in the drawer, but left the drawer open. A reminder, a connection to his brother, to the man Thomas had been, to the ideals he'd represented. Eli undressed and lay in bed, but sleep wouldn't come. His mind kept turning over the events, examining them from different angles. The look on Dalton's face when he'd realized he'd lost. The sound of the gunshot, the weight of the new badge on his chest. He thought about Cade Brennan, still alive, still out there somewhere. The man who'd killed Thomas. Eli had thought that chapter was closed, that justice had been served 5 years ago, but it hadn't been. Brennan had survived, rebuilt, orchestrated this entire confrontation. And now he was gone again, disappeared into the territories with his remaining men. Should Eli go after him? Finish what he'd started 5 years ago? The old Eli, the quiet gun, would have already been saddling his horse, loading his rifle, preparing for the hunt. But the new Eli, the one wearing the deputy's badge, had different obligations. He'd promised to protect Silver Creek, to serve the town. He couldn't just ride off on a personal vendetta, no matter how justified. Besides, what good would it do? Killing Brennan wouldn't bring Thomas back, wouldn't change what had happened, would just add another death to the long list Eli already carried. No, he'd let Brennan go. Let the man live with his failure, with the knowledge that he'd set up the perfect revenge scenario and still lost. That was a worse punishment than death for a man like Brennan. Living with defeat, living with the proof that he wasn't as good as he'd thought. Eli finally drifted off near dawn, his sleep troubled by dreams. He saw Thomas, alive and laughing. Saw Dalton falling backward, the surprise on his face. Saw Sarah Whitmore in the saloon, terrified and alone. Saw all the moments of his life compressed into a single stream of images and emotions. He woke late, sun already high. For the first time in years, he'd overslept. His body had needed the rest, had taken it despite his mind's protests. He made coffee, fed his animals, did the ordinary work of the day. But everything felt different now. He wasn't just Eli McGraw, rancher, he was Deputy McGraw. He had obligations beyond his fence line, responsibilities to people he barely knew. That afternoon, he rode into Silver Creek, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. Wanted to see how the town was recovering, wanted to check on Sarah and her family, wanted to begin the work of being what he'd promised to be. Sheriff Dawson was in his office, looking years younger than he had a week ago. The weight of responsibility had been shared, the burden lightened. "Morning, Deputy," Dawson said, smiling. "Or should I say afternoon? Morning, John. Thought I'd come by, see what needs doing. Right now, nothing much. Town's quiet. People are settling back into their routines. But having you here, wearing that badge, it means something. Makes people feel safer. Makes me feel safer." Eli settled into a chair. "Tell me about the job, the real job. Not the fighting and shooting, but the everyday work. I've been away from this for a long time." Dawson nodded, understanding. "The everyday work is mostly just being present, visible. People knowing there's law they can turn to if they need it, settling disputes before they become violence, walking the street at night, making sure businesses are locked up, making sure drunks get home safe. It's not glamorous. Most days it's boring, but it matters. That I can do," Eli said. "I know you can. That's why I wanted you to have that badge. Not because you can outdraw young punks like Dalton Reese, but because you understand what the badge really means. Service, protection, being there for people who need you." They talked through the afternoon, Dawson, sharing stories and advice, Eli listening and learning. This was a different kind of work than he'd done before. Not the quick violence of his younger days, but the slow, steady work of maintaining order and keeping peace. As the sun began to set, Eli walked the streets of Silver Creek. People nodded to him, greeted him by name, thanked him again for what he'd done. Children pointed at his badge, eyes wide with awe. He was becoming part of the community in a way he'd never been before. It felt good, felt right, like finding a place he'd been searching for without knowing he was searching. He'd spent 5 years running from who he was, but maybe he'd been running in the wrong direction. Maybe the answer wasn't to hide from his skills, his past, his nature. Maybe it was to use them differently, to channel them toward protection instead of revenge, toward peace instead of violence. Thomas had known that, had tried to tell him in dozens of conversations Eli only half remembered. The gun didn't make you good or evil. What mattered was who you were when you wore it, what you chose to protect, who you chose to be. Eli was choosing now, and for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was choosing right. 3 months passed. Summer gave way to autumn, the aspens turning gold on the mountainsides, the air carrying the first hints of the winter to come. Silver Creek settled into a comfortable rhythm, and Eli found his place within it. He kept his ranch, but spent 3 days a week in town, wearing the badge, doing the work. The other days he tended his land, maintained his solitude, found the balance between service and self-preservation. It was a good arrangement, sustainable, a way to honor both his need for peace and his obligation to others. The work was exactly as Dawson had described, mostly boring, occasionally challenging, rarely violent. He broke up fights in the Silver Queen, settled disputes between neighbors, helped Mrs. Henderson's cat down from a tree one Tuesday afternoon. He walked the streets at night, checked doors, made sure the town slept safe. It wasn't glamorous, but it mattered. Sarah Whitmore was healing. Slowly, gradually, the nightmares fading. She'd started coming into town again without fear, had even smiled at Eli the last time their paths crossed. That smile meant more to him than all the thanks and praise he'd received. It meant she was reclaiming her life, her dignity, her sense of safety in the world. One afternoon in late October, Eli was sitting outside the sheriff's office when a wagon pulled up. Henry and Margaret Whitmore, with Sarah beside them. But this time, Sarah wasn't frightened or shaken. She looked confident, purposeful. "Mr. McGraw," she said, climbing down from the wagon, "I wanted to give you something." She handed him a small package wrapped in brown paper. Inside was a leather bookmark, carefully tooled with an intricate design of mountains and pine trees. Along the bottom, in careful lettering, were the words, "For the man who stood up." "I made it myself," Sarah said. "I've been learning leatherwork from Mr. Henley at the general store. It's not much, but I wanted you to have something to remember that you made a difference, that you changed someone's life." Eli held the bookmark, feeling the careful craftsmanship, the hours of work that had gone into it. "This is beautiful, Sarah. Thank you. I'll treasure it." "You saved more than just my life that day," she continued. "You saved who I am, how I see myself. You taught me that there are still good men in the world, men who stand up for what's right, even when it's hard. That's a gift I'll carry with me forever." After they left, Eli sat holding the bookmark, thinking about gifts and legacies and what we leave behind. Thomas had left a badge and a memory of courage. Eli was leaving what? Not a reputation as a gunfighter, not stories of violence and death, but something quieter, maybe more important. The knowledge that someone had been there when it mattered, that someone had stood up. That evening, he rode to the cemetery on the hill east of town. He hadn't been there since the day he'd made his promise, 5 years ago. The guilt had kept him away, the fear that he'd failed his brother by walking away from the fight. But now he went, carrying different feelings, not guilt, but gratitude, not fear, but peace. Thomas's grave was well maintained. Someone had been putting flowers there, probably some of the townspeople who remembered him, who honored his sacrifice. The headstone was simple. Thomas McGraw, Deputy 1850 to 1877, a man who stood for justice. Eli knelt beside the grave, his badge catching the light of the setting sun. "I'm wearing one again," he said quietly. "Told myself I never would. Told myself I was honoring you by choosing peace, but I was wrong. Peace isn't about hiding from the world. It's about standing in it, being part of it, protecting it when you can." He paused. "You knew that. You always knew that. I was just too stubborn to see it." The wind moved through the cemetery, rustling the grass, carrying the scent of pine and approaching winter. Eli stayed there as the sun set, talking to his brother, telling him about Sarah Whitmore, about Dalton Reese, about the choice he'd made and the life he was building. "I miss you," Eli said finally, "every day. But I'm starting to understand that missing you doesn't mean living in the past. It means carrying forward what you taught me, what you believed, that good men have an obligation to stand up, to be counted, to refuse to look away." He touched the badge on his chest. "I'm trying, Thomas. I'm trying to be the man you believed I could be. Not perfect, but present, here, standing up when it matters." He stood, his knees protesting slightly, getting older every year, but not too old, not yet. He still had time, still had work to do. As he rode back to his ranch, Eli thought about the past 3 months, about the moment he'd stood up in the Silver Queen and changed everything, about the choice he'd made and the consequences that had flowed from it. He'd killed a man, broken his promise to his brother, stepped back into violence after swearing it off. On paper, those seemed like failures, but he'd also saved a town, protected innocent people, shown that courage still existed in a world that often felt like it was losing its way. Maybe that was what life was, a series of complicated choices, none perfect, most difficult, all carrying consequences you couldn't fully predict. Maybe the measure of a man wasn't in avoiding mistakes, but in making peace with them, in doing the best you could with the information you had and the skills you possessed. Thomas had done that, had made his choices and lived with them and died standing up for what he believed. Eli was doing the same now. Different choices, maybe, different path, but the same core commitment to stand when others sat, to act when others froze, to be present in the world instead of hiding from it. The stars were emerging as he reached his homestead, the same stars that had watched him make his first promise, break it, remake it. The same stars that would watch him keep this new promise, not to be perfect, not to avoid violence entirely, but to use his skills in service of something larger than himself. He unsaddled Rosie, fed the animals, went inside his house. The bookmark from Sarah Whitmore sat on his small table, catching the lamplight. A reminder, a gift, a promise kept. Tomorrow he'd ride back to Silver Creek, walk the streets, wear the badge, do the work of keeping people safe. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't the stuff of legends, but it was enough. It was everything. Some moments in life test who we really are when we choose to look away or stand up for what's right. Eli had made his choice, and in making it, he'd found not just his purpose, but himself. The man he'd always been, underneath the reputation and the violence and the grief. A man who stood up, a man who refused to look away. A man who, when the world asked for courage, answered with his presence. That was the legacy worth leaving. That was the promise worth keeping. That was enough.